I'm always tempted when I see an audience like this to say, Sam Harris needs no introduction, and then sit down. But you're such a weird group, I know that maybe I'll say something to try to find out why you're here. Of the three horsemen, or the great trinity of those people who have been called the new atheists, we have had or tried to have all three of them here. Christopher Hitchens got sick and had to cancel. Richard Dawson was here, filled the place, and lectured for an hour about evolution in Berkeley. We had to go out and try to find somebody in Berkeley who didn't believe in evolution. So I'm expecting more from Sam Harris. Sam Harris's credentials are so numerous. He, after an experience with ecstasy, he dropped out of college and decided to try to find the way to wisdom and enlightenment in a more direct way. I went to India, meditated, learned a great deal about this tradition, came back, went to Stanford, and graduated. After that, he also took a degree in neuroscience, a PhD in neuroscience. He's written, I believe this is 4 books, End of Faith, Letters to a Christian Nation, and now the Moral Landscape, which is very appropriate for Berkeley because it's trying to see how science can determine and enlighten values and our senses of right and wrong, good and evil. I think it's even gentle to say that Sam is a iconoclast, especially of religion. He's been very hard on all forms of fundamentalism, especially Islam, and that might give some of us in the progressive religious movement make us feel more comfortable. But the fact is, he's pretty critical of progressive religion also, seeing it as very often enabling of those with more radical beliefs. I always think how when I read of him, that how Paul Tillich said, we always need atheists around. Believers need atheists. Sam is not an atheist, but he and Hitchens and Richard are also, can be said, anti-theists. They are warriors in the battle against ideas of God which are demeaning and which produce violence and ignorance. So it's nice to have him here. No, I don't think nice is the word. It will be illuminating to have him here. Sam.
Thank you. Put this here. Thank you so much. Well, Sam, that is the first introduction that has detailed my history of drug use. So I think it's probably appropriate here in Berkeley. Well, it's an honor to be here. I've never spoken in Berkeley before, and as many of you know, I've been speaking for the last 6 years or so, very critically about religion. And when you criticize religion in public, what you immediately get are all the reasons why people think that's a terrible idea. And the first reason is never that there's so much evidence that God exists, that you're denying the obvious, that you haven't read the Bible closely enough. The first reason, even from fundamentalists, the truth of religion is not the first line of defense. The first reason is that religion, it is imagined, offers the only possible framework to think about morality in truly global terms, in universal terms. And there are several things wrong with this claim. Obviously, it's not an argument. It's not, even if it were true, it wouldn't prove that God exists. Religion could function as a placebo. It also doesn't reconcile the obvious contradictions among the world's religions. It doesn't reconcile the contradictory truth claims of Christianity and Judaism, or Christianity and Islam. So it is kind of a non sequitur as a defense of God. But I used to think it was a totally empty claim, but now I've come to believe that actually religious people and even fundamentalists, perhaps especially fundamentalists, are worried about something that is worth worrying about. They're worried that secular people, for the most part, have become convinced that something has happened in the last 200 years of intellectual discourse that has made it impossible to speak about moral truth. And I continually meet people who seem to have had their convictions of moral truth eroded by something that has happened in science and philosophy. And this is I think, troublesome. I think we are in danger of waking up in a world where the only people who are sure that moral truths exist are religious demagogues who think the universe is 6,000 years old. And that's not a world we should be eager to live in. So I'm going to push your intuitions around on this front. But just to give you a sense of the problem and to tell you how this issue is really seared onto my brain, I'll tell you a little story. I was at a conference a few years ago talking about the link between morality and human well-being, as I'm going to tonight. And I said something that I thought would be quite uncontroversial in this context. I said, listen, we know that morality relates to human well-being. We know that human well-being relates to the facts that allow mind to emerge in the brain, and so it's constrained by truth claims in some sense. And therefore we know that certain cultures are wrong about how to maximize human well-being, and therefore they're wrong in terms of what they value. And I cited as an example life for women, especially under the Taliban. It seemed to me their violent misogyny and religious lunacy was a pretty obvious context in which people, especially women, were not thriving. Now, it turns out to denigrate the Taliban at a scientific conference is to court controversy. And so after I spoke, another speaker came up to me and said, well, how could you ever say that the compulsory veiling of women is wrong from the point of view of science? And I said, well, okay, the moment you link questions of right and wrong to questions of human well-being, then it seems pretty clear that forcing half the population to live in cloth bags and beating them or killing them when they try to get out is not a way of maximizing well-being, and therefore not a good practice. And she said, well, that's just your opinion. I said, okay, well, let's just make it easier. Let's imagine we found a culture that was removing the eyeballs of every third child. Okay, would you then agree that we had found a culture that was not perfectly maximizing human well-being? And she said it would depend on why they were doing it. Okay. So after I picked my jaw back up off the floor, I said, okay, let's say they're doing it for religious reasons. Let's say they have a scripture which says every third should walk in darkness or some such nonsense. Okay. And you'll be pleased or horrified to know that she just bit the bullet here and said, then you could never say that they were wrong. Okay. Now this was a woman who has a background in science and philosophy. She's now on the President's Council for Bioethics. She's one of 13 people advising our President on all of the issues related to progress in medicine and life science generally. She had just delivered a totally lucid lecture on the moral implications, as she saw them, for the use of neuroscience in our courts. She was very worried that we have been developing lie detection technology and that we are using this on captured terrorists. And she viewed this as an invasion of cognitive liberty. Okay, so on the one hand, her moral scruples were really finely calibrated to our own possible missteps, in this case in our war on terror. But she was rather sanguine about the ritual enucleation of children. And it seemed to me terrifyingly detached from the very real suffering of millions of women in Afghanistan at this moment. So this kind of impossible juxtaposition of views is something I'm encountering a lot now among disproportionately well-educated and liberal people. So it's something we have to grapple with. Now, the issue for most people is that it has been said over and over again that there's a distinction between facts and values, and that science and rationality generally can only really make truth claims about the former. So science obviously can deal with facts. We have a universe of facts that we can understand to a greater or lesser degree. Facts transcend culture in some basic sense. But it's thought that values are another thing entirely. Values are the domain of questions of right and wrong and good and evil, and inconveniently for us, this is the area where the most important questions in human life arise. These are questions like, how should you raise your children? What goals should you strive for in life? What constitutes a good life? And it's thought that science will never be able to tell us the right answers to these questions. Just as science is never going to tell you whether you should like chocolate over vanilla, it's not going to tell you how you should raise your children or treat your neighbor. Now, I think this is an illusion. I think this is quite confused, and it's a dangerous illusion, for as I said, it erodes the conviction of very smart people in the face of really barbaric practices which occasion needless human misery. Now, it's long been obvious that we have needed a universal framework to think about values and morality. In the immediate aftermath of World War II, the UN put forward its Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and yet the American Anthropological Association, am I down here? Yeah. In all its wisdom, came forward and said, this is a fool's errand. You can't put forward a Universal Declaration of Human Rights because you're merely foisting one provincial notion of value onto the rest of humanity. It's an intellectually illegitimate thing to do. Okay, now this is the best our social sciences could do, really with the crematory of Auschwitz still smoking. This is 1947. Now, I think the connection between facts and values is actually straightforward and philosophically uninteresting. And I'm going to elide many of the common categories and distinctions one finds in philosophy and in what's called metaethics. I just want to say that there's going to be a Q&A afterwards, and if you think I've missed some crucial bit of philosophy in my treatment here, please come to the mic and deliver the devastating argument. I want to hear from you. I don't want you to leave with your doubts intact, but I'm convinced that many of the categories we have in philosophy to talk about the truth value of morality and the relationship between values and facts are needlessly confusing, and there's just no reason to keep rehashing these ancient and, I think, truly moribund debates. Values reduce to facts about the well-being of conscious creatures. The well-being of conscious creatures is what can be valued in this universe. If you doubt this, just imagine a universe populated entirely by rocks. Okay, rocks presumably have no inner dimension. There's nothing that it's like to be a rock. We are right to be unconcerned about the experience of rocks because we think there's no possibility of experience there. And I think we are right to be more concerned about our fellow primates than we are about insects because we think that there's an inner dimension there that can be modulated to a much greater degree by changes in the universe. In a universe, for changes in the universe to matter, they have to matter to some conscious system. Now, if you doubt this, here's the one bit of philosophy I'm going to anchor this to. This seems to me the only assumption you have to buy. imagine a universe in which every conscious creature suffers as much as it possibly can for as long as it can. Okay, I call this the worst possible misery for everyone. Okay, the worst possible misery for everyone is bad. Okay, if the word bad is to mean anything, surely it applies to the worst possible misery for everyone. Okay, now, if you don't think the worst possible misery for everyone is bad, or you think there might be something worse, or you think it might have a silver lining, I don't know what you're talking about. And I'm pretty sure you don't know what you're talking about either. The moment you grant me that the worst possible misery for everyone is bad, okay, and therefore worth avoiding, and if we should do anything in this universe, we should avoid the worst possible misery for everyone, well then, you have the worst possible misery for everyone over here, and you have every other possible constellation of conscious experience, which by definition is better. Okay, so you have this continuum here of possible states of consciousness, and given that consciousness is related to the way the universe is, it's constrained by the laws of nature in some way, there are going to be right and wrong ways to move along this continuum. There are going to be ways to think you're avoiding the worst possible misery and to fail. It's going to be possible to have erroneous beliefs about how best to move from your current space on this continuum to something better. Now, this is, in philosophy, a somewhat controversial statement. Again, I do not see how. But it meets with objections of the following sort. You hear people say, well, what if someone wanted to torture all conscious beings to the point of madness? How could you ever prove that he's not as good as you are? Okay, I mean, this is the kind of email I get. Okay. Or more relevantly, how could, if a member of the Taliban wants to throw battery acid in the face of a little girl for the crime of learning to read, how could you ever convince him that he's not as moral as you are? Again, this is really the kind of email I get. Now, this is a pseudo-problem. Notice we don't confront this. Oh, I failed to anticipate a slide. A religious conception of morality, again, falls into the same concept of well-being and its possible changes, the conscious well-being of creatures. So if you are concerned about a lifetime of happiness with God after death in heaven and avoiding a lifetime of misery in hell, again, you are concerned about consciousness and its changes. You just happen to think consciousness and its changes are most importantly experienced after death for eternity. Now again, this is a claim about which science has some rather obvious doubts, but this is still the same framework. We're talking about consciousness and its changes. Now, this challenge, this fundamental skeptical challenge about well-being not being worth valuing, and how could you convince someone who doesn't value it? Notice how this maps onto our notion of physical health. Okay, physical health is loosely defined. Okay, we don't have a clear definition of health. We sort of know it when we see it. It has something to do with not dying too early. It has something to do with not always vomiting, okay, not being in continuous pain. Now, if we re-engineer our genome so that we can live to be 1,000 and regrow missing limbs like a salamander, okay, that will become part of our expectation of basic physical health. So this notion of health is truly elastic, and yet the fact that it can't be clearly tied down is not a problem for the science of medicine. No, you don't hear a philosophical challenge to medicine of the following sort. Who are you to say that not always vomiting is healthy? What if you meet someone who wants to always vomit and wants to be dead tomorrow? What you don't hear someone say, how would you convince a person with terminal smallpox that he's not as healthy as you are. Okay, this kind of attack upon medicine would make no sense. And yet this is precisely the attack one hears from moral relativists and multiculturalists when you talk about the very obvious and needless and horrific misery of millions of people in situations that are anchored to really pathological notions of good and evil. Now, even the most basic, apparently value-free descriptions of fact in science are also anchored to values in a way that would never survive this kind of skeptical challenge you meet when you talk about morality. Consider water. Okay, water is a substance we now dimly understand. For about 150 years, we've known it's 2 parts hydrogen and 1 part oxygen. What do we do when someone doubts that proposition? I mean, what do we do if someone comes into the room and says, well, that's not how I choose to think about water? You know? What do we do when someone says, well, I'm a biblical chemist, and you can get your chemistry from science, but I get my chemistry from the book of Genesis, and whatever squares with Genesis is chemistry for me. Okay, now, again, see the analogy to moral truth. The only thing we can do in that case is appeal to scientific values. I mean, you have to value understanding the universe. You have to value evidence. You have to value logical consistency. If you don't value these things, the conversation stops. There is no convincing someone who doesn't value evidence that they should value it. What evidence are you going to provide to convince someone that they should value evidence? Okay, what logical argument are you going to offer to convince them of the necessity of obeying the rules of logic? Okay, so even the most basic scientific statements, I mean, you don't get more basic than the chemistry of water, you don't get more value-free than the chemistry of water, are anchored to values at every point. So this covers Hume's famous notion of you can't get an ought from an is. You can't get a statement of how we should behave or how the world should be based on a description of the way it is. You can't get an is without an ought. You can't make the most basic scientific statement without conforming to the norms of scientific rationality. So science is very much in the values business. It is a myth that there's this division between facts and values in science. Now, there's another way to bridge this supposed gap between facts and values. And it's this, when you look more closely at what beliefs are, we form beliefs about the world in many domains. We form beliefs about facts, obviously, and this constitutes science, but it constitutes every truth claim we make about the world, journalism and common sense and your personal memories of your past. But we also form beliefs about values. And this includes religion and ethics and questions of right and wrong and good and evil. We decided to look at these operations at the level of the brain. We put people in fMRI scanners and gave them statements to read, statements from many different categories, and just looking to see if the difference between judging something true and rejecting another statement as false was sensitive to content. So statements from science, statements from religion, statements from ethics, and we found that the brain is essentially doing the same thing independent of content. So on the left, we have all of our categories binned together, and you get this region of signal in what's called the ventromedial prefrontal cortex. And in the middle, we have mathematics, and on the right, we have ethics. So mathematics and ethics were probably our most different category areas. I mean, mathematics was just equations. You just had true and false equations. Ethics was statements like, it's good to be kind to children versus it's good to torture children. Okay, so obviously very value-laden statements. And the difference between accepting a proposition and rejecting it seemed to be importantly similar. Within the tolerance of an fMRI experiment, those are essentially the same maps. So I'm not placing too much emphasis on this, but I would just suggest to you that if the brain thinks it's doing the same thing when it's accepting a proposition about ethics versus rejecting another proposition about ethics, and accepting mathematical statements versus rejecting mathematical statements, then I think we should be very slow to break our worldview into separate fundamental categories of values and facts. So I would suggest to you that belief is really our best effort to map reality in our thoughts. And when we seem to succeed in doing this, when our beliefs about the world survive the tests that the world throws up at them, well, then we call it knowledge. Then we don't talk about believing things, we talk about knowing things. But still, we're simply talking about linguistic representations of the world. And I think it's clear that there is a continuum of facts about which we could form true or false beliefs that relate very directly to human happiness, to the question of how human beings, both individually and collectively, can flourish. And there's clearly a continuum where, on the one hand, you can live in a failed state where everything that can go wrong does go wrong. Think of a place like Congo at the moment. This photos from Somalia in the 80s, but Congo at this moment, I mean, Somalia is also a failed state, but the worst example probably of any place to be at this moment is Congo, where everyone's daily concern essentially is to avoid being raped and killed by drug-addled soldiers. I mean, where there's just absolutely no basis for cooperation, to think about the education of children. Things can go disastrously wrong in human communities, but they go wrong for a reason. And how we move from a state of absolute and needless misery to something much more idyllic, that movement is still constrained, clearly, by the dynamics of human psychology and social systems and economic incentives and the rule of law. I mean, all of these, we can't just make everything up. I mean, this is not merely culture that explains these movements. And clearly there are many levels at which we could understand how human life can be improved, how human well-being can be maximized. There's the level of the genome. I mean, clearly there are genes for positive social emotions that people can have to a greater or lesser degree. And there's, at the other extreme, the dynamics of economies and political arrangements. But every place in between, we're talking about anything that can possibly influence states of the human brain. We're talking about genetics and neurobiology and psychology and sociology and economics. So I'm not talking, when I talk about science giving us an understanding of human values, I'm not narrowly talking about white lab-coated experimentalists scanning brains. I'm talking about any area of human life where we make truth claims honestly, based on honest observation and clear reasoning about the nature of reality. There are clearly right and wrong ways for human beings to seek to thrive. And this, I think, is easy to see. If you just imagine two people living on Earth, we can call them Adam and Eve. If you just think of two people here, it's pretty clear that they have better and worse options. They're better and worse responses to the predicament of simply appearing in this place. Bad option number one, they could smash each other in the face with a large rock. Okay. Clearly that is a failure to discover the most promising sources of collaboration that the human condition offers. Now, how does this change when you add 6.7 billion people to the experiment? I don't think it does. It just gets more complicated. So what I'd ask you to consider is what I call a moral landscape, where the peaks correspond to the heights of well-being, and the valleys correspond to the lowest depths of suffering. And one thing to realize about this analogy is that it's pretty clear that there can be multiple peaks on this landscape. It's not obviously so, it doesn't have to be so, but I think it's quite plausible that there are many different ways for human beings and human communities to thrive that are dissimilar and therefore importantly different, and if you're living one way, you can't live another way. But clearly there are going to be many more ways to not be on a peak. There are going to be many more ways to fail to be as happy and as creative and as intelligent as human communities could be. Now, why wouldn't multiple right answers be a problem? Well, consider the analogy of food. I would never be tempted to argue that there must be one right food to eat. There are clearly many right answers to the question, what is food? But there are obvious wrong answers. I mean, the distinction between food and poison is still scientifically true, and it's true even with all of the caveats. I mean, some people are allergic to peanuts. They'll die if they eat them. Peanuts are a poison for them, but a food for us. We can understand all of this in the context of chemistry and biology and every science related to human health. People also worry that if there's going to be an ethical principle that's true, it has to always be true, and if you find a single exception, well, then there's no such thing as moral truth. Well, consider by analogy the game of chess. Okay, the principle of not losing your queen in chess is absolutely worth following almost all the time. It is one of the best things you can seek to do. And yet it admits of nearly countless exceptions. There are moments where losing your queen is a brilliant thing to do. Now this is, think by analogy, the principle of not lying. Now not lying, truth-telling, is obviously, in so many circumstances, a good thing to do. I mean, telling lies is just almost the easiest way to screw up your life. And yet, when the Nazis come knocking on the door and asking whether you have Jews in the basement, that might be a time to forget about Kant and tell your first lie. Now, the fact that there's a situational exception to the principle of not lying does not mean that there's no such thing as moral truth. This model of a landscape also admits of the possibility of what we call spiritual or mystical experience. I think that there's no question that the human mind is capable of having remarkable self-transcending experiences, and many of which can be very hard-won, many of which you have to have a talent, perhaps, to access, and certainly training to access. And many positive social emotions that we all experience can be brought to a much higher register than we bring them. I mean, something like compassion or empathy. I used to be in the habit of saying that undoubtedly there's a Tiger Woods of compassion out there. For obvious reasons, that analogy doesn't work so well at the moment. But I think compassion is best thought of as a skill. It's clearly trainable. It's clearly something that people have to a greater or lesser degree. And we're beginning to understand the neurology of both its appearance and its encouragement. Our minds are, to a significant degree, plastic. I mean, you sort of become what you pay attention to. And this is something a maturing science of the human mind really can put us in a position to understand. How many of you recognize this photo? This is a photo of apparently very happy Nazis. You can't quite make it out. This is from a book that's now called the Auschwitz album. There was a photo album that was discovered in an attic somewhere of just Nazis having a gay old time. And it took some research to figure out who they were and what they were doing. These were people working at Auschwitz during the peak of its productivity as a factory of death. And they were at a kind of a chalet that was a few kilometers from the death camp. So this is more or less their mood as they were listening to accordion music and lying in the sun and eating blueberries under the plume of human ash coming out of the crematory of Auschwitz. Now, there's nothing about my view of the moral landscape or the link I'm drawing between morality and human well-being that insists that I deny the obvious happiness of these people. I mean, I don't think they're fake smiles that we see there. I think these are, and I don't think these people are psychopaths. I think for the most part these are normal people who would go home and pet their dogs and cats, and they love their children, and they would listen to Wagner and shed a tear. The problem with these people was not that they had a radically different conception of morality. They have a moral circle that they had radically delimited. I mean, they had put most of humanity outside the sphere of their moral concern. And that's what we continually run into in the world. Based on some divisive dogmatism, we run into groups of people who just manage to put the better part of humanity, or significant groups of humanity, outside the theater of their moral concern. Now, I want to talk about Islam for a moment, because I think we are wise to be concerned about it. As you know, I'm concerned about religion in general, but I think we're wise to differentiate specific religious beliefs. And we are, I think, quite encumbered by political correctness and just frank confusion on this front. One problem is that we have this one-word religion, which names this truly diverse spectrum of fascinations and ideological commitments. And religion is a nearly useless term. It's a term like sports. Now, there are sports like badminton, and there are sports like Thai boxing. Okay, and they have almost nothing in common apart from breathing. Now, there are sports that are just synonymous with the risk of physical injury or even death. I mean, there's sports that are just synonymous with violence. Now, if you get injured playing badminton, you're just embarrassed. We're facing a problem at this moment. There is, I'm happy to say, a religion of peace in this world, but it's not Islam. Okay. To call Islam a religion of peace, as we hear ceaselessly reiterated, is completely delusional. Now, Jainism actually is a religion of peace. Jainism is the core principle of Jainism is nonviolence. Gandhi got his nonviolence from the Jains. The crazier you get as a Jain, the less we have to worry about you. It is. This is. I mean, Jain extremists are actually they are paralyzed by their pacifism. Jain extremists they can't take their eyes off the ground when they walk lest they step on an ant. They filter every sip of water through cheesecloth lest they swallow and thereby kill a bug. I mean, needless to say, they're vegetarian. So the problem, notice, the problem is not religious extremism, okay, because extremism is not a problem if your core beliefs are truly nonviolent. The problem isn't fundamentalism, which we often hear this said. These are euphemisms. I mean, the only problem with Islamic fundamentalism are the fundamentals of Islam. Now, we have Mullah Omar and Osama bin Laden and Khalid Sheikh Mohammed. These guys agree about the nature of reality and how to live within it. And the problem is they are giving a very plausible version of the faith. Osama bin Laden is not the Reverend Jim Jones of the Muslim world. It would be wonderful if he were, but the problem is he is giving a truly straightforward version of Islam, and you really have to be an acrobat to figure out how he's distorting the faith. Now, if these guys were Jains, or Buddhists, or Amish, or Quakers, it would be patently obvious how they were distorting their religion. I mean, in fact, their behavior would be unintelligible. Okay? It is not obvious by the light of Islam, and this is just a fact we have to speak honestly about. And no one should be speaking more honestly about this and more volubly about this than moderate Muslims. Moderate Muslims have to find some way to grapple with this fact. But to say that Osama bin Laden is David Koresh is just a lie, and it's a dangerous lie at this point. Now, I just want to rehearse for you what these core beliefs are and what they entail. The belief is that Muhammad got the Quran directly from the Archangel Gabriel in his cave in the 7th century. And it is the perfect word, therefore, of the creator of the universe. I apologize for the cartoonish nature of this image of Muhammad, but quality images are difficult to come by at the moment. Now, the consequence is we have this single book, which is imagined to be the best book on any subject ever written, never to be superseded by any human effort at any point in the future. Now, this is a problem because this is a profoundly mediocre book. Okay? It is dangerous to say this. It is suicidal to say this as a Muslim. It is true. And we have to grapple with this fact. And the idea that this is the best book ever written on any subject can only be maintained in a kind of fantastical intellectual isolation. And this isolation has actually been achieved in the Arab world to an astonishing degree. Some of you probably have heard this fact, but the country of Spain translates more of the world's literature and learning into Spanish every year than the entire Arab world has translated into Arabic since the 9th century. Okay, that's scary. It's scary given that the contents of this book really offers precious little rationale for living in a sane and pluralistic global civilization. What it does give you a rationale for is ceaselessly worshiping the perfect being who has given you this mediocre book. And this is a photo of Muslims in Kashmir worshiping at a shrine believed to contain a single beard hair from the Prophet Muhammad. Now, in showing you this image, I don't actually mean to denigrate the positive emotions that can be associated with this kind of practice. I mean, I think devotion is a positive emotion that we want in our lives. And I certainly don't mean to make light of how difficult life undoubtedly is for Muslims in Kashmir. But it seems to me patently obvious, given the challenges that they face and that we all face in creating a world worth living in, these people have something more important to do than worship the beard hair of a man who may well have been a schizophrenic. And again, when I talk about Islam, one thing I should make perfectly clear and should have made it clear at the top, I'm talking about the logical and behavioral consequences of ideas. I'm not talking about people. I'm not talking about all Muslims. Not all Muslims are terrorists, obviously. Not all Muslims support terrorism. Not all Muslims take Islam all that seriously. I'm certainly not talking about a race of people. I'm not talking about Arabs. I'm not talking about nationalities or ethnicities. I'm talking about ideas and what people can plausibly do on their basis. And what people do on the basis of these ideas, it turns out to be very bad for women to a remarkable degree and in general. And there really is no basis in Islam to argue that there should be true equality between the sexes. I mean, you can finesse this issue, but what you cannot get is just a clear statement of men and women are equal and have the same moral stature. It's just not true. You have to edit the faith to get that. And one thing you also get by the logic of the faith at this moment is this death cult behavior that we're now all too familiar with. Suicide bombing of the most extraordinary and ceaseless kind. I mean, you can reliably turn to page 8 of the New York Times every day and discover that someone has blown up a mosque somewhere. First thing to point out is that no one suffers by this more than Muslims. I mean, they're Muslims getting killed by this. It's not Americans, for the most part. This is a bombing in Pakistan, where a Sunni bombed a Shia procession. Now, the Sunnis view the Shia as apostates, and bombing them makes sense. The core issue here is this notion of martyrdom. The notion that death in defense of the faith is the surest way to paradise. Okay, this belief is what makes sense of this behavior. Now, I want to linger over this image for a minute, actually. This is a little girl. You can't quite see her in this lighting, but this little girl crouched over the corpse of her mother. And this is actually not the initial bombing. What they did is they bombed a procession of Shia pilgrims, and then they sent another suicide bomber to the hospital to wait for the ambulances to come in to blow up the casualties and the doctors and the nurses and the ambulance drivers. So this is a shot from outside the hospital. And just imagine this. I mean, just imagine what it was like for someone to come up with that idea. It's kind of creative in a truly diabolical way. Someone had to volunteer to be the suicide bomber. I mean, someone had to get up in the morning thinking this is the best use of his life, to blow up this little girl's mother. And I mean, this is, again, realize this is not collateral damage. This is the point of the exercise. In fact, by this logic, by the logic of this belief, it is impossible to kill the wrong people, because all the good Muslims you blow up are going to go to paradise, and they're going to thank you. All the bad Muslims, all the apostates and the infidels are going to go to hell where they belong. It is impossible to screw this up. Okay. Now, just so you don't get the sense that I'm narrowly focused on Islam, I would point out that the moment you see the link between morality and human well-being, you can see that notions of right and wrong and good and evil that come to us from religion often break this connection. And that's what's so dangerous about religion. I mean, in the best case, religion gives people bad reasons to be good where good reasons are actually available. In the worst case, it just disregards human well-being entirely. So, for instance, the Catholic Church is simply more concerned about stopping contraception than stopping the rape of children. I mean, that is a fact about both the beliefs of this particular person, the use of his energy over the last several decades, and just the energy of the Church. If you know anything about the child rape scandal in the Catholic Church, it is mind-boggling, the effort that was not spent to protect children and the effort that was spent on sheltering the rapists from secular justice. The Catholic Church is also more concerned, incidentally, about stopping gay marriage than stopping genocide. I mean, this is what its attention is on. Okay? This, when you realize that questions of right and wrong actually relate to questions of human well-being, this is not morality. This is not an alternate moral framework that we have to take seriously. The Catholic Church could talk about physics. It could say, well, we're actually interested in the physics of the transubstantiation, or the physics that allows the Holy Ghost to be here and there and everywhere all at once. But there's not a physicist alive who would have to take those utterances seriously. Okay, I'm saying that if you talk that way, you don't get invited back to the physics conference. What I'm saying is that the moment we admit that morality relates to human and animal well-being, you don't have to get invited back to the morality conference either. Now, I'm going to briefly, remind you of some of the reasons why religion can't be the repository of our moral wisdom generally. One is that when we we go to Scripture, we're the guarantors of the wisdom we find there. We find the golden rule, and we say, aha, that's why you should read the Bible. Okay, that's just about the wisest thing ever said. But then we includes fundamentalists and Orthodox Jews, we ignore the rest of the book. We ignore the places in Deuteronomy and Leviticus and 2 Samuel where the most mind-numbing theocratic barbarism is recommended. So we bowdlerize the book. So clearly our moral tools are coming from outside the text. There's also the fact that there's obvious contradictions between the world's faiths. And this is a map of world religion. This is an example I've taken from my colleague Richard Dawkins. This is not how knowledge spreads over the face of the earth. I mean, there's no reason, if you're in the business of understanding truths of any kind, truths about human well-being, truths about the universe, you wouldn't expect your belief system to hug national boundaries in this way. And no one, I think, if you just imagine India, is it possible that they believe, the billion Hindus in India at the moment, that they alone, among all the world's people, well, they could probably build me a better remote, there's no doubt about that. Do they even think that they know that Ganesh, the elephant-headed god, exists and must be worshipped? I mean, this is not the way we're discovering things about the nature of the world. The people are accidentally born into the right belief system by dint of geography. Now, apart from the contradictions between faiths, there are impressive patterns of contradiction within every faith. Each one of these red arcs is linking